Hi, I'm here to talk about the isolation and quarantine guidelines for CHUSD students. New guidance has come from Fresno County regarding the protocols for isolating and quarantining staff and students. The following guidelines are meant to reduce the further transmission of COVID-19 whenever individuals have been exposed. They are the best practice based on the current situation and knowledge available to authorities, and they are subject to change as circumstances warrant. Our first isolation protocol for students is for the student who is symptomatic or asymptomatic with a positive test. This student will isolate for the 10 to 1 day schedule. Our second student is symptomatic but has not taken a test, or they're awaiting lab results. This student will isolate on the 10 to 1 isolation schedule, or they will provide documentation of a chronic condition such as asthma, allergies, or irritable bowel syndrome from their healthcare provider. Or they will have an alternative diagnosis, such as strep or flu, for their current illness from a healthcare provider. Or they will provide a negative test result. Our third isolation protocol will be for the vaccinated, symptomatic, and positive student. They are still required to isolate for the 10 to 1 isolation schedule. Our first quarantine protocol for students involves a student who is exposed to someone in their household who has a positive test result, whether they are symptomatic or asymptomatic. If the student is asymptomatic, they will begin a 10-day quarantine from the last day of contact with the affected member. Or, if the student remains asymptomatic, they have no symptoms, they can end their quarantine after day 7 if they have taken a test on or after day 5 and the result is negative. Our next quarantine protocol for students involves exposure outside of the same household to someone who is symptomatic or asymptomatic with a positive test. If one or both of these persons were unmasked and within 6 feet of each other for greater than 15 minutes, the 10-day quarantine will be put into place from the last day of exposure without testing. Or, if the student remains asymptomatic, quarantine can end after day 7 with a negative test result from a test taken on or after day 5. Our next quarantine protocol for students is a modified quarantine. This involves exposure outside of the home, and both students were masked, although they were within 6 feet of each other for more than 15 minutes. The modified quarantine begins from the date of last contact as long as the student remains asymptomatic. The modified quarantine requires that the student wears their mask at all times on campus, including outside and during physical activity. The student is not allowed to participate in class activities that require the mask to be removed, such as playing a woodwind or brass instrument. The student is also excluded from all extracurricular activities during the 10-day isolation period. This includes sports and activities out in the community. No quarantine is needed for a student who is exposed to someone with a chronic condition, a alternatively diagnosed condition, or someone who is exposed to someone else in their household. If any student develops symptoms at any time, please refer to the preceding quarantine or isolation guidelines. If a student develops symptoms or tests positive at any time, the student is required to notify his or her campus health office and follow the directions they are given about quarantine and isolation. This is how we stay open. This is how we stay in person. Thank you.